Bitter Creek Valley. Winter 1851. 4 men stepped out of a blizzard. Evie had only expected one. Miss Thorne. Yes, teeth knocking together. Gideon Stone, no handshake. My brothers. She looked at all 4 of them. I thought there'd be one of you. Cassian almost smiled. You answered a proposal from all 4 of us, Gideon said. We should have been clearer. So I came out here. Her voice cracked for 4 husbands. You came for a home. His eyes didn't move. What happens after is your call. Then her legs gave out. Gideon caught her before she hit the snow. 1 arm. No fuss. 1 woman. 4 brothers. 5 orphans. 1 buried secret. How far would you go to find where you belong? The whistle screamed. Not a greeting, not a warning. It was a helpless sound, swallowed almost instantly by the wind that tore through Bitter Creek Valley, like something alive and starving. Genevieve Thorne Evie, to anyone who'd known her longer than 5 minutes, pressed her face against the frost-laced window glass and saw nothing. White, just white in every direction, not the peaceful kind. The kind that looks like erasure. She tightened her grip on the journal, leather-bound, soft at the corners from years of her father's hands. Heavy with things she didn't yet fully understand. She had $1 in her coat pocket. 1, and the clothes on her back. That was the entire plan. Get off the train, find her husband, start over. The train lurched. Steam hissed. Evie stood, pulled her wool coat across her chest, and stepped off the platform into what felt like the edge of the world. The cold hit her like a wall. Not Chicago cold. Chicago cold was a nuisance, something you grumbled about on your walk to the market. This cold had weight to it. It pressed into her lungs and made her breath come out in short, useless gasps. Her shoes, city shoes, completely wrong for this, sank into snow up to her ankle on the very first step. The platform was empty. No lanterns, no station master, no one. She turned. The train was already moving. She spun back. The town, if Bitter Creek could be called. A town sat huddled a quarter-mile away, its windows glowing like dim coals through the white curtain of the storm. Between her and those windows was nothing but wind and ice and open, merciless ground. Evie stood there for 3 full seconds. Then she started walking. She made it about 50 yards before she heard the wagon. 4 horses first. That was what she noticed. 4 massive draft horses materializing. Out of the white like a dream, steam rising from their dark flanks, then the wagon behind them. Iron-rimmed wheels crunching over packed snow, then the men. 4 of them. She stopped walking. She should have kept going, but she stopped. Because 4 men appearing out of a blizzard when you were expecting, one does something particular to your legs. They pulled the horses up just short of her. The man in front climbed down from the driver's bench. He was tall, not the kind of tall you register indoors. The kind that makes sense only in open space, where there's nothing beside it for scale. A long saber scar ran from his left collarbone down toward his chest, visible at the open throat of his coat. He didn't seem to feel the cold at all. He looked at her, Miss Thorne. His voice was steady, not warm exactly, more like a stone wall, not unfriendly, just solid. Yes, she said. Her teeth had already started knocking together. Gideon Stone. He didn't reach for her hand. He just said it. These are my brothers. Cassian, Ezekiel, Julian. She looked at the other 3. Cassian had amber eyes that were already scanning her coat, her shoes, the journal tucked under her arm, taking inventory, the way a tracker reads a trail. Ezekiel was enormous, a blacksmith's build, shoulders like a barn beam. He stood very still, which was somehow more striking than if he'd been moving. Julian was the youngest looking of the 4, lean, with something in his expression that didn't belong out here. Something careful and cultivated, like a book left in a tool shed, I thought, Evie said, her voice cracking on the cold. There would be one of you. Cassian's mouth moved. Almost a smile, we know, Gideon said. You answered the proposal we placed together. We should have been clearer about that. A pause. We weren't. She looked at him. He held her gaze without flinching. So I answered a marriage proposal, she said slowly. From 4 men, you answered an offer of a home, he said. What happens after that is your business. She didn't know what to say to that. She was also running out of time to figure it out, because the cold was doing something to her thoughts, pulling them apart at the edges. Her fingers had stopped aching about 2 minutes ago, and she knew from her father's training that this was worse than aching. She swayed. Gideon took 1 step forward, not rushing, just closing the distance between what was happening and what needed to happen. Can you walk? He asked. Yes, she said, and then the ground came up. She didn't feel herself fall. She felt Gideon's forearm catch her before she hit the snow, a firm, flat surface. Nothing grabbing, nothing clutching. He held her upright with exactly enough force and not a single ounce more. She's got hypothermia. Starting, Julian said from behind. His voice was measured, clinical, even half-conscious. She liked that, I know, Gideon said. They moved her to the wagon. She was aware of it without being fully present for it. Blankets came from somewhere. Heavy canvas ones, smelling like wood smoke and pine. She was laid across the wagon bed, and Zeke's massive coat was draped over her, without comment, without ceremony. The 4 men rode or walked alongside. No one climbed into the wagon bed with her. No one touched her beyond what was needed to keep her alive. She drifted. The wagon moved. The storm roared. At some point, the wind changed. Walls appeared, firelight. She was inside. She came back to herself the way warmth always returns in pieces. First her feet, burning now, which meant feeling, which meant good. Then her hands. Then the whole of her, shivering hard on a low bed near an enormous stone hearth. The fire was massive. The room was big, rough-hewn, built for function. Animal pelts on the floor, iron tools hanging on pegs. And in the corner, 5 small sleeping shapes. Children. The littlest couldn't have been more than 3 years old. Gideon was there, sitting in a chair a respectful distance from the bed, hat in his hands. He waited until her eyes steadied on him. Good, he said. You're back. She pushed herself up on her elbows. Everything ached, but it ached the right way. The children, she said, orphans. He didn't dress it up. We brought them out of a mining camp last winter. 7 of them. 5 made it through. A beat. We're soldiers, Miss Thorne. We know how to build things and how to defend things. We don't know how to raise children. We needed help. She held his gaze. He wasn't making a speech. He was just telling her the truth. And the proposal, she said, the mail order one, was the best idea we had. He didn't apologize for it. We needed a woman, not for what men usually mean by that. We needed someone with warmth, with knowing. You fit the description your letter gave. Evie sat up fully. Her coat hung dry near the fire. Her journal sat on the small table beside her. No one had opened it. She noticed that. She noticed it consciously, and it meant something. Gideon looked at her straight. Out here, he said, you are no mail-order commodity. He said it plainly, like a fact he'd settled on long ago and had no interest in debating. You are a human being with total self-determination. We offer you shelter, and the choice to stay or leave, come spring, is entirely yours. The fire cracked. One of the children shifted in sleep and murmured something small. Evie glanced over at them, then back at Gideon. And if I leave in spring, she said, we drive you to the train ourselves. No arguments, no conditions. She was quiet a moment, and if I stay, something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, a small, careful acknowledgement the kind a person makes when they don't want to promise too much too soon. Then we figure it out together, he said. Evie looked around the room, at the fire, at the sleeping children, at the rough walls of a fortress built by men who didn't know how to be anything but honest. She looked at the journal on the table, her father's handwriting worn to a ghost on the cover from years of touch. She had $1. She had a secret she didn't yet fully understand, but she had gotten off the train. She had walked through the white. She was still here, still breathing, still thinking. That, she decided, was enough to build on. Morning came gray and honest. Evie was up before anyone else. She came down the stairs of the Bitter Creek General Store at first light, boots already on, coat already buttoned, journal tucked under her arm. The main room was empty, except for a banked fire and a tin mug of coffee sitting on the counter with a folded note underneath it. She picked up the note. Coffee's hot. Horses loaded. Take your time. GS, she read it twice. Not because it was complicated, but because she appreciated it. 2 words of instruction and a signature. She'd known men who used 40 words to say nothing at all. She drank the coffee, standing up, looking out the frost-rimmed window at the mountain. Iron Peak, she could see it clearly this morning, which she hadn't been able to last night through the storm. It was enormous in the way that resets your idea of what normal-sized things look like. The peak itself was lost in low cloud. The face below the cloud was granite and snow and shadow, and somewhere on that face was the trail up to wherever the men called home. She finished the coffee, picked up her journal, and went outside. The 4 men were finishing with the horses. Same drafts as last night, massive, dark, breathing hard columns of steam into the morning cold. The wagon sat loaded with supplies, grain sacks, iron tools, wrapped bundles that clinked and settled when the horses shifted weight. Cassian worked along the lead animal's rigging with the focused attention of a man who trusts nothing he hasn't checked personally. Zeke was tightening bolts on the rear axle with a wrench the approximate size of a small child. Julian stood slightly apart from the others, studying the trail ahead with an expression Evie was already beginning to recognize as his thinking face. Gideon saw her first. "Sleep all right," he said. "Well enough," she said. It was approximately true. He nodded. He took the journal from under her arm gently, with a look first that asked, rather than assumed, and packed it in a waterproof oilskin case with the rest of her bag. He didn't look at the cover, didn't turn it over in his hands, just stowed it safe and helped her up onto the wagon bench. They moved out as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. The first mile was manageable. The trail was wide, packed hard from previous runs, and the horses knew the grade. Evie sat on the bench beside Gideon and watched Bitter Creek shrink behind a curve in the trail until it was gone entirely, and then there was only the mountain. Cassian rode ahead on a roan mare, reading the terrain the way some men read newspapers, scanning, measuring, processing without appearing to. Occasionally, he raised a hand without turning around, and Gideon slowed the horses without needing an explanation. Julian rode alongside at an even pace, now and then scribbling something in a small notebook with a worn pencil stub. Zeke sat in the wagon bed, one forearm resting on a coiled length of heavy iron chain. "How far?" Evie asked. 4 hours in good weather," Gideon said. He kept his eyes on the trail. Today, 6. She looked at the sky. It had gone the color of old pewter. "And if the weather turns worse, it won't?" he said. "A beat? Probably." She nearly laughed. She wasn't yet sure whether that was a dry joke or just honesty, which she suspected was somewhat the point. The trail began climbing in earnest at the 2nd mile. What had been a road narrowed to a path. The path squeezed between a granite wall on the left and open air on the right, and Evie kept her eyes fixed on the horse's ears and not on what was below the right edge, which was a considerable amount of empty sky. The near-fatal moment came without warning of any kind. A sound, a sharp structural crack from somewhere under the wagon. Gideon pulled the horses up hard, but the rear left wheel had already found the trouble. A patch of black ice under a skin of packed snow, and beneath the ice, a rock shelf angled at exactly the wrong pitch. The wheel shattered against it. The wagon lurched hard to the left, tilting toward the drop, and Evie grabbed the bench rail with both hands and held. The world went sideways. Gideon had the reins locked in both fists, standing on the footboard, legs planted. The horses screamed and stamped and pulled forward, and he held them there, holding the whole bucking, terrified weight of 4 draft horses through his arms and shoulders, holding the wagon on the trail by keeping the front animals from bolting free. 3 feet below the broken wheel, the cliff edge. Below that, nothing visible. just gray air falling away into white. Cassian came off his horse before the wagon finished its tilt. He was at the heads of the lead horses in 4 strides, his hands already on the lead animal's bridle, his voice cutting through the noise in a low, flat tone that wasn't soothing exactly, but was authoritative and specific. And it worked. The animal stopped trying to lunge forward. Its panic didn't disappear, but it went still. "Zeke," Gideon said, his regular voice, cutting through everything anyway. Zeke was already in motion. He had the chain off his shoulder and over the side of the wagon before Evie fully tracked what he was doing. He dropped from the high side of the trail, braced both boots against a boulder below the path, and ran the chain around the rear axle in a loop that looked like pure instinct. He hooked the other end to an iron ring, bolted into the granite face, one of several mounted along the trail's worst sections. She would learn later. Put there by the men years ago for exactly this reason. The chain went taut. The wagon stopped tilting. Julian appeared at her side of the bench. "Come down toward me," he said. "Clear. Don't look at the edge. Keep your eyes on my hand." She came down toward him. He caught her with both hands at her waist, moved her back from the wagon to solid ground in a single controlled motion, and put her back against the granite face. "Stay here," he said. She stayed. She pressed her spine against the stone and breathed. Her father had taught her that. Find something real and cold, and put your weight against it until your pulse comes down. She put her weight against the mountain and watched the 4 men work. 40 minutes. They levered the wagon back onto the trail using a combination of the chain, 2 timber poles, and Zeke's brute strength applied at angles that seemed to defy reason. They swapped the broken wheel for a spare from the wagon bed. They redistributed the load. Gideon directed the whole operation in the same quiet, level voice he seemed to use for everything. No raised voices, no panic. Just men who had solved serious problems in cold places before and knew that loud didn't help when it was done. Gideon walked back to where she stood against the granite. He looked at her face. Just looked at it, briefly and directly. "You're all right," he said. "I'm all right," she said. He offered his arm, elbow bent. She took it. They walked back to the wagon together and didn't speak about it again. Iron Peak Fortress appeared first as a dark shape through the tree-lined square and deliberate against the white hillside. Then, the palisade wall resolved into focus. 12 feet of vertical logs sharpened at the top, with firewatch platforms at the 2 forward corners. Then the main gate, iron-banded and standing open. They passed through it, and Evie felt the wind drop immediately. Cut off by the walls. And she understood then what it meant to have built something that held. Inside the compound sat the main house, a low timber structure with real glass in the windows. Smoke rising from 2 separate chimneys. Beside it, a forge building, its chimney cold and dark for now. Further back, a stable and smokehouse, a root cellar, half buried in the hillside, and a wide communal hall connected to the main house by a covered walkway. 5 children poured out of that hall the moment they heard the wagon. Gideon climbed down, and the youngest, a girl of about 4, with 2 black braids and an expression of grave seriousness entirely, at odds with her size, walked straight to him and attached herself to his leg without a word. He put a hand on the top of her head. Automatic. Practiced. "This is Miss Thorne," he said to the assembled children. 5 pairs of eyes turned to her. She climbed down from the bench and stood in the packed snow of the courtyard and looked back at them. "Hi," she said. The braided girl studied her for a long moment with the careful attention of a senior judge. "You have the city on your shoes?" she said. Evie looked down at her soaked, entirely inadequate city shoes. Then back up. "I do," she said. The girl appeared to find this satisfactory. She released Gideon's leg, took a fold of Evie's coat in her small fist, and that was apparently that. Her name was Hannah. The others were Thomas. 9, a collector of interesting rocks. Miriam and Clara, 6-year-old twins who communicated in a private language no adult had yet decoded. And Samuel, 11. Quiet and watchful, who reminded Evie of Julian in ways she couldn't immediately articulate. Her room was in the main house, second door on the right, window facing the mountain. A real bed, real mattress, a writing table, a washstand, a hook for her coat. Nothing extra, nothing missing. Gideon showed her the door last. He pointed to the iron bar mounted on the inside face of the door. Interior deadbolt, he said. Yours, no one enters from the outside. No one knocks after 10 o'clock without a reason you'd judge sufficient. He looked at her directly. Any of us, that includes me. She looked at the deadbolt. Solid iron, well-mounted, no wobble in the bracket. Thank you, she said. He nodded and left her to it. She slid the bolt across that first night, just to feel what it felt like. To hear the sound, a solid, final, entirely satisfying clunk. She stood with her hand on the iron and let herself breathe all the way out for what felt like the first time in days, maybe weeks. Then she lay down on the clean mattress and slept for 11 hours straight. The first week moved in layers. There was the cold, which she was gradually learning to work with rather than against. There was the altitude, which she felt as a faint pressure behind her eyes that she'd been told would pass. There were the rhythms of the forge, firing at dawn, the communal breakfast that Gideon almost always started before anyone else was awake. Loose supervised lessons. Julian ran for the children at the big hall table. There were the men themselves, who were so consistently decent and orderly in their behavior that she sometimes had to remind herself to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. There were also the practical matters of being severely underqualified for frontier life. She couldn't split firewood. She tried, and it was humbling. Cassian watched from a distance of about 10 feet, said nothing, and at a certain point simply took the axe and demonstrated the wrist angle without comment. She tried 3 more times and improved marginally. She couldn't manage the big wood stove's firebox temperature with any consistency. She couldn't skin anything. She was reasonably good at tending fires once they were going, and she was already excellent at dressing wounds, a skill she'd been honing since she was old enough to assist her father, but there hadn't been occasion to demonstrate that yet. She decided to bake bread. She had a theoretical framework. She'd watched her mother. She knew the ingredients, knew the rough proportions. She found the flour, the salt, the tin of baking powder on the kitchen shelf. And she started in the early afternoon while the children were occupied and the men were at their work. The oven temperature was the first problem. The firebox in the big stove was nothing like the gas range she'd grown up with. She couldn't read it. She packed in too much wood, decided it was still too cool, packed in more, and then Hannah needed help with a knot in her bootlace, and then Clara had somehow gotten pine sap in her hair. And by the time Evie came back to the kitchen, the smell that greeted her was not the smell of baking bread. She went for the oven with her bare hands. She registered the mistake approximately 1/2 second after making it. The burn covered both palms, fast and complete, and she dropped the pan with a crash that brought Hannah back to the kitchen doorway. Eyes enormous. Evie stood in the smoke with her hands palm up and her face very still. "I'm fine," she told Hannah. "Go find Zeke." "Don't run," Hannah ran. Evie moved to the washstand and got her hands under the cold water pump. She held them there, both palms up. Water flowing over the blistering skin. She knew burns. She'd helped her father treat more of them than she could count. She knew what the next few days would look like, and she knew she'd be all right. And she knew how to do exactly what needed to be done. What she hadn't prepared for was the weight of everything else landing on her at once. The train, the blizzard, the cliff, the strange beauty of this place, the exhaustion of being new at everything, the bread on the floor. Her hands in the cold water, all of it pressing in at the same moment, her breath came out uneven. Not quite crying, not quite not. Zeke filled the doorway. He was a large man. He made the kitchen smaller just by standing in the doorframe, but not in any way that felt threatening. It was just his scale. He looked at her hands. He looked at her face. He did not look at the bread on the floor. which she appreciated more than she could have explained. He crossed the kitchen and gently moved her away from the pump. He looked at both palms in the light from the window, turned them carefully, assessed the coverage of the burn. "Sit," he said. She sat. He went to a shelf and came back with a tin. Bare grease, mixed with something pine resinous that smelled medicinal. He sat down across from her and opened the tin and began applying the salve to her burns with an application of care that seemed entirely disproportionate to his hands, which were the size and apparent density of small anvils. Each stroke was measured, even. He worked from the burn's outer edge inward, covering the raw skin completely, and he was entirely silent while he did it, which was exactly right. The pain didn't vanish. It changed, softened from sharp to manageable. Evie watched his face while he worked. He wasn't performing sympathy. He wasn't searching for the right thing to say. He was simply attending to the problem in front of him with his whole attention, which turned out to be the exact right thing. When he finished both palms, he held them cupped in his for a moment, checking his work. Then he looked up. "I'll take the chores today and tomorrow," he said. "You rest." "I wanted to help," she said. It came out smaller than she'd intended. "You helped," he said. "Hannah's boot is tied," she laughed, surprised by its sudden short, real. He almost smiled. Just a small movement at the corner of his mouth, but it was there. Supper appeared on the table that evening, without Evie, near a stove. Gideon cooked. Cassian cleaned afterward. Julian managed the children's hands and faces with a patience that still mildly astonished her. Zeke brought in firewood and stacked it without being asked. No announcements, no production. They just divided it up and did it the way a household works, when the people in it understand that the work belongs to all of them equally. Evie sat by the hearth with her bandaged hands in her lap and watched the children eat by firelight. Hannah was explaining something at length to Samuel, who was listening with the grave courtesy he applied to most things. Clara and Miriam had traded shoes for reasons unclear to anyone but themselves. Thomas had a rock in his pocket that he kept taking out and looking at. She watched them, and she let herself feel it honestly. She was glad she'd gotten off that train. She was glad she'd walked through the white. 3 weeks into winter, Julian started playing the violin in the evenings. Not every evening, not on any schedule. He'd come in from whatever he'd been doing, helping the children, reading, working through the botanical notes he kept in that small notebook, and at some point he'd go to his room and come back with the case and simply play. He was very good. That was the first thing. Not just competent, not just passable. He played the way people who've given most of their youth to something play with the fluency that goes past technique into something harder to name. He'd sit near the fire, the instrument tucked under his chin, and within a few bars, the quality of the air in the hall would shift. The children got quieter, not sleepy necessarily, just stilled, like something in the music set them at rest. Evie asked him about it once, where he'd studied. "Back east," he said, which was true but wasn't really an answer. She filed it under things she'd learn eventually and left it there. She'd been learning things gradually. The fort had its own daily grammar, and she was getting fluent in it. She knew which floorboards in the main hall creaked and in what sequence. She knew that Gideon's coffee was always too strong, but that pointing this out accomplished nothing. She knew that Cassian's silence wasn't unfriendly. It was just the natural condition of a man who spent most of his working hours alone in terrain, where talking served no purpose. She knew that Zeke hummed under his breath while he worked, tuneless and low, and that the humming meant everything was fine. She was also proving useful in ways she hadn't expected. Thomas had a bad tooth she extracted cleanly with her father's instruments, and the relief on his face afterward was so complete and sudden that she'd had to look away. Clara had developed a cough in the second week that she treated with a steam tent and a botanical preparation. Julian helped her source from his own supplies. He knew his plants. She knew her physiology, Between them, they'd gotten the cough under control. In 4 days, your father trained you properly, Julian said one afternoon, watching her pack away the surgical kit. He did, she said. She kept her eyes on the instruments. Her father was still a subject with soft edges. She didn't push on it. Julian didn't push either. He understood, she thought, the geography of subjects that needed to be left alone for a while. The accident at the forge happened on a Tuesday. Evie was in the main house with the younger children, working through a simple arithmetic lesson with Miriam and Clara, when she heard it. Not the sound of an explosion, it wasn't that dramatic. More like a single loud clang, followed by a strangled sound from the forge building, and then silence, where there'd been the steady rhythm of hammering. She was out the door before she fully formed the intention to move. The forge was orange inside. Gideon's fire built it that way, hot and very bright. Cassian was on the ground near the anvil. One hand braced on the floor, the other pressed hard against his left thigh, and the blood was already showing dark and fast between his fingers. A piece of iron, a fragment from a workpiece that had failed under stress. She'd understand later. Had taken a piece of the anvil's surface with it and driven itself into his thigh at an angle, not deep enough to hit the femoral artery. She checked that first automatically, even before she knelt. The blood was dark, not bright red and arterial, which meant she had time to work. Cassian's face was gray. His jaw was set hard. How bad, he said. It wasn't really a question. He was asking her as a clinician, not as someone frightened. I need to look, she said. Move your hand. He moved his hand. She looked. The fragment had gone in at an angle, lodged in the outer quadrant of the thigh, deep into the muscle. She could see the shape of it under the skin. Getting it out cleanly, without causing more damage, was going to require the full kit. Real light, and Cassian being very still. I can take care of this, she said. I need my father's instruments, and I need the oil lamp from my room, and I need someone to hold him steady. She looked up. Gideon was already in the doorway. She didn't know when he'd arrived. I need you, she said to him. Tell me what to do, he said. Come with me to the house. I'll explain on the way. She stood, pressed her own scarf against Cassian's thigh. Hold that there. Press hard. We'll be 2 minutes. Cassian pressed his hand over hers without a word. She walked fast. Gideon walked beside her. She explained, as they went, what she needed, what she was going to do, what position she needed Cassian in, where Gideon's hands should be, and what they needed to accomplish. Gideon listened, without interrupting, without the flinching or hedging she might have expected from a man being asked to assist field surgery. He just absorbed it. She collected the surgical kit, her father's leather roll of instruments, cleaned and oiled and ordered as her father had always kept them. Scalpel, hemostatic forceps, needle holders, curved suture needles, catgut, silk thread, the oil lamp from her room, a bottle of carbolic solution from the kit's inner pocket. Julian was waiting in the doorway of the forge when they returned. She looked at him. I know what you're doing, he said. I've assisted before. Tell me what you need, and I'll do it. She believed him. His background was scattered and unfinished, but it was real. And he held himself with the practiced ease of someone who wasn't going to panic at the smell of blood. Watch my left hand, she said, whatever it needs. Have it ready before it needs it. He nodded. Zeke came to the door of the forge, saw Cassian on the floor, saw Evie's expression, and without being asked, turned around and went back to the hall where the children were. She heard his low voice through the wall, and then the children's voices, and then nothing from that direction. He'd managed it. She let it go from her attention and focused. They moved Cassian to the workbench, cleared of tools, and covered with a clean canvas drop cloth she pulled from the corner. Getting him up there took both Gideon and Julian, and Cassian got a good grip on his own reaction, which Evie respected. He made a sound when his thigh moved, once through his teeth and then nothing more. She set up the lamp. The orange glow of the forge and the cleaner, white light of the lamp together gave her what she needed. She washed her hands with carbolic. Dried them. On clean linen, Cassian, she said. He turned his head to look at her. This is going to take some time, and it's going to be uncomfortable, she said. I know you understand that. What I need from you is stillness, not silence. If you need to make noise, but your leg cannot move. He looked at her for a moment. His amber eyes were still very sharp, even through the pain. Do what you need to do, he said. She did. She made the incision clean and decisive, the kind of cut her father had always described as an act of confidence rather than aggression. You don't hack at tissue. You declare your intention and commit to it, and the tissue responds accordingly. The fragment came into view immediately, exactly where she'd estimated. Irregularly shaped, with one edge that had gone in deepest. Julian had the hemostatic forceps right before she opened her left hand. She worked through it systematically. Control the bleeding. Expose the fragment. Assess the angle before removing. Remove without dragging the worst edge through clean tissue on the way out. Check for pieces left behind. Irrigate. Assess the muscle damage. The muscle damage was significant but not catastrophic. A deep bruise more than a tear, it would heal. She began the sutures. Gideon held Cassian's leg with both hands, steady and firm, and he was as still as the granite scar across his own chest. Cassian made 2 sounds during the stitching, both controlled, both short. He gripped the edge of the workbench with one hand and kept the rest of himself still. Evie counted as she went. 5, 10, 15. Julian kept the light positioned where she needed it, swabbed when she indicated, had the next suture threaded before she asked for it. He didn't speak. He watched her hands and he thought ahead, which was exactly the right kind of assistance. 20, 21, 22. She tied off the last knot, cut the thread, and set down the needle holder. She stood back. She looked at the wound. Even and closed, the tissue opposed correctly, the tension right. She covered it with clean linen and carbolic. Then she let herself breathe. The forge was quiet except for the low voice of the fire and the settling of the building against the wind. Cassian had his eyes closed. He was breathing slow and controlled, bringing himself back from wherever the pain had taken him. It's done, she said, to all 3 of them, really. Gideon looked at the sutures. His face was unreadable in the usual way, but he stood looking at it for a moment longer than necessary. 22, Julian said quietly, reading the count she'd been keeping aloud during the procedure. The wound needed it, she said. She cleaned the instruments herself, methodically, the way her father had always insisted, each one in sequence. Each one checked and oiled before going back in the roll. Cassian opened his eyes. Evie, he said. She looked at him. He didn't say anything else for a moment. He looked at her with those sharp, amber eyes. And she had the sense that he was the kind of person who said very precise things when he said anything, and that he was choosing. Now, thank you, he said, straight and plain, no performance in it. She nodded. They got Cassian to his room with Gideon and Zeke taking his weight between them, and she checked the wound one final time and left instructions with Gideon for the night positioning. What to watch for, what would be fine, and what would require her immediately. Gideon repeated the instructions back to her without being asked. She confirmed each point. Later, well into the night, she heard Julian's violin. He was playing in the hall, she thought, or perhaps in the covered walkway between the buildings. It moved through the cold air, that sound something slow and unresolved, a melody that kept starting and finding new paths instead of coming to the obvious conclusions. She lay in her bed and listened to it through the timber wall, and thought about her father's hands on his own instruments, about the way a person who truly knows what they're doing looks when they work, about the particular combination of knowledge and steadiness and willingness that lets someone do difficult things well. She thought she was starting to understand these men. She thought they were starting to understand her. Tomorrow, Cassian would have a fever, she expected. The body's ordinary response to trauma, which she would manage with willow bark and cool compresses in time. Julian would probably have opinions about botanical additions. She would probably find them useful. Gideon would stand in the doorway and not get in the way, which was its own kind of help. Zeke would keep the children busy and the fire going and the fort running in all its ordinary daily ways, because someone always had to. And the children would run through the hall, and Hannah would tell someone their shoes were wrong, and Thomas would find a rock, and the violin would play in the evenings. The frontier wasn't gentle. It had made that clear from the first moment, but it was honest, and it had room. She was beginning to understand for all kinds of strength, not just the kind you could see. The storm came on the 5th day of March. No warning. 1 hour, the sky was flat and white and ordinary. The next, it was moving a wall of dark cloud rolling down off the upper peak with a speed that made Cassian pull up short outside the stable. Watch it for 3 full seconds and say one word to no one in particular. Inside, everyone heard it. That was the thing about Cassian. He didn't project. He just spoke at exactly the volume a thing needed, and somehow it always reached exactly as far as necessary. They were all inside by the time the first real gust hit the fort. The gate was barred. The shutters were up on the windward windows. The livestock were in the stable, with extra hay. The root cellar was stocked. The woodpile under the covered walkway was 3 weeks deep. Gideon had built this fort for exactly this possibility. That much was clear. The storm sealed them in for 10 days. Evie had lived through Chicago winters. She'd read about blizzards in the Sierra Nevada, in the Dakotas, in the high Rockies. She thought she understood what the word meant. She learned on day 1 that she did not. The wind alone was a revelation. Not the Chicago kind that pushed you sideways on a street corner. This was wind that made the entire building shudder, that drove itself through every crack and joint, and came out the other side as a fine mist of powdered ice inside the rooms. It was wind that sounded in the darkest part of the night, like something that intended to stay, but inside was warm. That was the other thing. Gideon had built for this too. The main hearth in the great hall was large enough to stand in practically, and the firebox design was his own. He'd explained it to her once in brief technical terms. Something about the draw and the heat distribution, and it worked. The hall held warmth in a way that felt almost architectural. Like warmth was a structural feature of the place, rather than something constantly being generated and lost. They were in close quarters for 10 days. It changed things, not in any single dramatic way. In the accumulation of small daily ways that happen when people are stripped of their usual distractions and left with each other and a fire and enough food and not much else. She played chess with Julian on the 2nd day. He beat her in 12 moves without appearing to try hard. She demanded a rematch, and he beat her in 15, which she counted as progress. He started explaining his thinking as he played, not condescendingly, but genuinely. The way someone explains a subject they love to a person they think is worth explaining it to, and she found herself actually following it, and then actually applying it, and by the 5th day she was making him work. "You're fast," he said, after she took his queen with a move she'd seen him use 3 games ago. "I grew up watching my father play," she said. "He always said the game was about patience and information. Know more than the other person knows. Wait longer than they expect you to." Julian looked at her over the board. "He sounds like someone worth knowing," he said. "He was," she said. "A beat." Julian didn't fill it with noise. He picked up his remaining bishop and considered his options, and let the silence be what it was. She'd come to appreciate that about him. He handled sorrow without trying to fix it. Gideon taught her to sharpen a knife properly on the 3rd day. Not because she asked, but because he saw her struggling with her father's scalpels and sat down across from her at the work table without preamble and demonstrated the angle and the pressure and the number of strokes per side. He had large hands, and the whetstone looked small in them, and the motion was entirely even like breathing. She practiced while he watched. He corrected once, twice, then sat back. "There," he said. She ran her thumb very lightly across the blade's edge. Even she could feel the difference. Where did you learn? She asked. The army taught us most things, he said. The mountain taught us the rest. Which was the better teacher, he thought about it. Honestly, she could tell, which meant a pause of actual length. The mountain doesn't have preferences, he said. It just has conditions. You meet them or you don't. She turned the scalpel in her hand. The army has preferences, she said. The army, he said, has a great many preferences about what a person ought to be and do and sacrifice. A beat. The mountain just wants to know if you're paying attention. Cassian was mending during those 10 days, which gave her a reason to be in his room at least twice daily. The wound had closed cleanly. The fever had come on the second day post-surgery, as she'd predicted, and broken on the fourth. And by the first week of the storm, he was upright and restless, and making increasingly specific complaints about the quality of the light in his room, which she interpreted as a good sign. He was a reader, which surprised her. His shelves held 3 field manuals, which she'd expected, and 2 volumes of Thoreau, which she hadn't. He caught her looking at the Thoreau and said nothing for a moment. My mother, he said eventually. She sent them out with me when I enlisted. He looked at the spines. I thought I was humoring her at the time, and now I've read them 4 times. He said so. She laughed. He didn't quite, but his amber eyes went warm in a way that amounted to the same thing. Zeke was making things. He couldn't work the forge in this weather. Too much risk of snow on the chimney cap collapsing and backing smoke, but he had his hands going constantly anyway. Small things, wooden things, a new set of building blocks for Hannah's corner of the hall, a better handle for the water pump, which had been irritating Evie for 2 weeks because the original grip was the wrong shape. A carved bird that he set in the window of Clara and Miriam's room without mentioning it. So they found it themselves. Hannah found Evie in the hall on the 6th evening and told her with great gravity that Zeke had made her a box with a lid that fit perfectly. For, Evie asked. Hannah considered. Important things, she said. Evie asked Zeke about it later. He shrugged, which on his scale was like a small geological event. She was keeping her important things in a flour sack, he said. Flour sacks don't have lids. That was all. He said about it. The evenings were long. The children went down after supper, which Julian managed with a calm, patient authority they all trusted. And then the hall was quiet except for the fire and the wind and whoever happened to be in it. Sometimes all 4 men, sometimes 2 or 3, sometimes 1. On the 7th evening, Evie sat in the big chair by the hearth long after the others had gone to bed and stared at the fire, not thinking about anything in particular. Just looking at it. She thought about her life before this mountain. A rented room in a city that went about its business around her. A respectable practice she'd assisted, rather than led. Plans that had felt solid, until the morning she'd opened her father's journal after the funeral and found the letter inside, with the address of a land office in Bitter Creek, Colorado, and a single sentence in her father's handwriting. Go west, my Evie. There are people there who will be worth knowing. She'd thought at the time that this was grief speaking. Her father's last impractical wish. She knew now it wasn't impractical. She sat with that for a while. She knew what she was feeling. She was a medical woman with a father who'd insisted on calling things by their real names. She knew that what had been building in her over these weeks wasn't confusion. It was clarity, which was sometimes more difficult to sit with than confusion. She was in love with this place, with these children, with this rough, principled, quietly extraordinary life. She was in love with 4 men who had never once in 7 weeks treated her as anything other than a full human being. She sat with the fire and the wind and that knowledge for a long time. She wasn't frightened by it. She was just honest about it. The way her father had always been honest about difficult things directly. Without wishing it were simpler than it was, she stood up. She walked to her room. She washed her face and brushed out her hair and stood for a moment in front of the door. Hand resting on the iron deadbolt, she'd slid into place every single night for 7 weeks. She slid it open. The sound was the same as it always was. Solid iron, real and deliberate. She opened the door and stepped out into the hall in her white cotton nightgown, with her hair loose and the firelight from the main hearth reaching partway down the corridor toward her. Gideon was the one who saw her first. He was still at the hearth, the last one up, as always, feeding a final log into the fire. He turned at the sound of her step and stood there and looked at her. He didn't speak. He just looked. There was no misreading his face. "I opened the door," she said, quiet, direct. "I want you to understand that I know what I'm doing. This is my choice, my whole choice. No one led me here." He held her gaze for a long moment. "I know," he said. She had opened her door. She had crossed the hall on her own 2 feet, with her whole heart behind her, and she would never be passive in her own life again. This place, this mountain, these men, had made absolutely certain of that. The 3 others came not by anyone's summons, but because the fort was small, and the night was quiet, and the fire cast long light. And because after 7 weeks together, they simply knew each other's rhythms. Julian came into the hall and stopped, read the room in one sweep, then Zeke. Filling the doorway from the kitchen corridor, his eyes went to Evie. He stood very still. Cassian came last, moving carefully on his healing leg, and then all 4 of them were there. And Evie was standing in the middle of the hall in the firelight, and nobody was pretending not to understand what this moment was. All 4 men crossed the hall slowly. There was a reverence in it, the measured pace of men who understood that this was not something to rush, not something to grasp at. They moved, the way you move in the presence of something real and rare, which is to say carefully and with full attention. They knelt around her on the rug, their heavy, calloused hands moving with painstaking gentleness to part the pale cotton of her gown, as Gideon and Cassian brushed against her intimate center, discovering the fierce heat and liquid fire of her complete surrender, a pure, helpless arousal from a virgin who trusted them with her entire heart. All 4 men froze. They looked up at her face in the flickering firelight, their breath catching in their throats, eyes dark with awe and breathless desire. "So wet," they whispered in unison, the words heavy and reverent in the quiet hall. What happened then was slow and deliberate, and entirely hers to direct. She was the one who set the pace. She was the one who said what she wanted, and what she needed, and what she didn't. She was never once in any doubt that if she had spoken a single word of hesitation, all 4 men would have stepped back without argument. She knew that because she knew them. 7 weeks of watching men who kept their word about the things that mattered. It was not a taking. It was a meeting. It was 4 men who had known war and cold and loss, and the particular loneliness of having built a good life with no one to share it. And 1 woman who had crossed half the country on $1 and a prayer, and turned out to be exactly what they hadn't known they were missing. Gideon was steadiness, the sure, unshifting kind. She leaned into it the way you lean into a wall that you know will hold. Cassian was intensity, focused and precise and completely present, every movement considered, nothing wasted. Zeke was gentleness that had no relationship whatsoever to softness, the gentleness of something enormous that has learned its own force. Julian was attention, the kind that notices everything and names nothing, and simply inhabits the moment with its entire self. The fire burned low. Outside, the blizzard continued its conversation with the mountain. Inside, at Iron Peak, in the long, warm dark of a 10-day storm, 5 people discovered that home was not a place you arrived at. It was a thing you built together, out of choice and time, and the willingness to be known. When she woke in the gray, early morning, all 4 of them were around her, sleeping, or nearly. The fire had been banked. The wind had dropped to something almost ordinary. She lay still and listened to the fort breathe. Then she reached for her father's journal on the side table, held it against her chest, and smiled at the ceiling. "There are people there who will be worth knowing." Yes, Papa, she thought. Yes, there are. The blizzard broke on the 10th day. By the second week of March, Iron Peak had become something almost like ordinary life. Not settled. The mountains didn't allow settled. Exactly, but routine. The children were improving at their lessons, which they had strong opinions about. Cassian's leg had healed well enough for light riding. The days were still short and cold, but the light when it came was a different quality than January light. Sharper, more honest about where it landed. Evie had fallen into a rhythm that made sense to her, in a way nothing had since her father died. Mornings, she helped Julian with the children's lessons, which had expanded into botany and basic anatomy after it became clear that Thomas, Samuel, and even quiet, Miriam had genuine hunger for knowing how things worked. After Nushin, she kept her clinic hours nothing formal, nothing that required a shingle, but the fort had enough activity that there was always something to attend to. Evenings belonged to all of them in the loose democratic way the fort had always operated. She'd started reading her father's journal in earnest. Not the medical portions, she'd known those since childhood, could recite the dosage tables and wound protocols from memory. She was reading the written portions, the notes her father had made in the margins over 30 years of practice. The personal entries he'd never mentioned. She'd discovered early on that he'd known the men of Iron Peak in some capacity, had corresponded with a land agent in Bitter Creek about a silver claim her grandfather had filed in 1851. Details she'd known nothing about, a financial history she hadn't been told. She was working out what it meant. On the morning of March 15th, the day the world ended briefly, she was sitting at the workbench in the main hall with the journal open and a cup of coffee at her elbow, and the children were in the back room with Julian, and all four men were at their various morning posts. Gideon was somewhere on the upper palisade. Cassian was in the stable. Zeke was at the forge, the steady ringing of his hammer counting out the morning. She had the journal flat open to the back cover, where she'd noticed something the previous night, a thickness in the leather that shouldn't be there, a very slight stiffness in the binding that didn't match the age and wear of the cover itself. She ran her thumb along the inner edge. She was about to investigate further when she heard the hooves. Not one horse, not two. Multiple. She counted the rhythm and came up with at least 8 before the sound of the gate being struck hard drowned everything else out. The hammering stopped. She closed the journal. The gate opened because Gideon opened it from the upper palisade, which is what you did when riders arrived at the fort, rather than show them a locked gate and a defensive posture, unless you already knew you needed one. She heard him call down, a single sharp syllable, then silence. Then the sound of multiple horses coming through the gate. She was on her feet. She didn't know exactly what she was preparing for, just that the quality of the silence after Gideon's call was wrong. She was still standing when the main hall door opened. The man who came in first was expensively dressed, which was so thoroughly out of place in this room, in this entire altitude, that it took her a full second to process. A dark wool coat with a fur collar, a gold watch chain at his vest, polished boots with exactly no mud on them, which meant he'd come from a warm coach, not from a long saddle, broad-shouldered, red-faced under a dark beard, eyes that moved across the room with the quick, assessing sweep of a man who has spent his life determining the value of things. She knew his face. It took one more second, then she knew. Bartholomew, she said. Sterling smiled. It was the kind of smile that belongs on documents rather than on human faces. Contractual, predetermined. Genevieve, he said, you are a difficult young woman to locate. Behind him came 2 others. One in a judge's collar, slack-faced, avoiding her eyes in a deputy's badge that looked new enough to still be shiny. And outside, she could hear them through the walls, more men, more horses. Gideon was in the doorway behind Sterling. Before Sterling had finished his sentence, he didn't announce himself. He simply occupied the space. You'll explain your business, Gideon said. Sterling turned, looked at Gideon the way wealthy men look at things that are technically in their way. I have a legal document, Sterling said. He didn't reach for a pocket. He nodded, and the judge produced it, a guardianship writ, properly issued and signed. Miss Thorne's father died intestate, or so we all believed, leaving his affairs in legal ambiguity. As an established business associate of the late Dr. Thorne and a citizen of standing, I have been granted authority over the disposition of his estate and by extension over his unmarried daughter. Evie's ears were very clear. Everything in her had gone still in the way things go still before they act. My father did not die intestate, she said. His estate was filed as such, Sterling said. The documentation supports that. The documentation, she said, was filed by you. Sterling's smile shifted by one precise degree. More patient, more dangerous. Genevieve, he said, I'm not here to argue. I'm here to fulfill a legal obligation, and in doing so to recover certain assets that belong to the estate. His eyes moved deliberately. She saw to the journal on the workbench, including any documents related to your grandfather's mineral claims in Bitter Creek County. And there it was. She understood, fully and suddenly, the thickness in the leather cover. He wasn't just here for her. He wasn't only here for her father's estate or any fraudulent guardianship. He was here because he knew or strongly suspected that her father had hidden something inside the journal cover. The original boundary deed to the silver claim, the legal document that would determine who owned what, and had always owned it since 1851. Cassian came through the side door. Sterling's eyes moved to him, then to the man beside him, who raised his hand, and the crack of the shot came through the wall, before Evie had time to finish the thought she was forming. Cassian went down hard, his right arm catching the door frame, blood spreading dark at his shoulder. Not the thigh this time, his shoulder. He hit the floor on one knee and stayed there, jaw locked, already trying to get back up. Evie moved toward him. A hand landed on her shoulder and stopped her, one of the deputies. Her body went rigid. Cassian, she said. She needed him to hear her voice. Don't move. Stay still. Look at me. His amber eyes found hers, good tracking. The shoulder wound was bad, but it wasn't mortal. The forge, Sterling said to someone outside. Evie turned. Don't, she said. Full voice. No tremor. The smell of smoke found them before she finished the word. Outside there was shouting, Zeke's voice, deep enough to feel through the floor, and then the hard clanking rattle of heavy chain, and she understood with sick clarity what was happening. They'd come prepared. They'd come with chains. Gideon was already pushing back. She could hear it. Then, more men than she could count, and Gideon's voice cut short, and Julian's voice saying something in a fast, measured tone that was either negotiation or law. Probably both. It didn't matter. There were too many of them. Gideon and Zeke and Julian were brought into the hall in heavy iron chains. Sheriff's chains, or chains wearing the costume of legality, which Sterling was evidently skilled at. The charge was read aloud by the slack-faced judge, who wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Unlawful restraint of a female ward. Unlawful resistance of a legal order. Gideon's face was a wall. He looked at Evie, and his eyes said one thing clearly. Don't give him the journal. She was already thinking about the journal. She was thinking about how much he'd known, how long he'd been watching, whether it was the land office, or the postal route, or something her father had told someone years ago. She was building the picture even while everything was falling apart around her, because her father had taught her that the moment you stop understanding a situation is the moment you lose it entirely. Sterling crossed to the workbench. He picked up the journal. She moved. She couldn't help it. She got 2 steps, and Sterling's hand came across her face. It wasn't the pain. It was the absolute contempt of it, the assumption that she was the kind of thing that could simply be struck and would absorb it and comply. She stood very still in the aftermath of it, her cheek burning, and stared at him. He stared back. He had what he came for. He had the journal. He had a corrupt document that assigned him authority over her life. He had 6 armed men and a captured fort, and 3 bleeding men in chains. He grabbed her wrists. They were bound. Not gently. She didn't cry out. She kept her eyes on the room, on Cassian, on the floor, still conscious, still watching her, on Gideon in chains, who was watching Sterling with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, on Zeke, who was not pulling against the chains, just standing in them, biting, on Julian, who had gone into the cold, precise stillness of a man rapidly assembling a plan. She was pulled toward the door, outside a heavy black carriage. Good horses, the kind of rig that said this had been planned. This wasn't impulse. Sterling had done this before. Done the paperwork, done the planning. Come with the right number of armed men to the right place at the right time. She was put inside. The door was locked. She turned and pressed her face to the cracked glass of the carriage window. The forge building was burning. Orange flame already up the back wall. Black smoke going straight up into the cold blue sky. The main gate was open. Men on horseback outside it, waiting. And in the middle of the courtyard, 3 men in iron chains, bleeding, watching the carriage move. Gideon, Zeke, Julian. Gideon's eyes found hers through the glass. She held them. He had told her, on the very first night, that she was a human being with total self-determination. That had not been simply politeness, and it had not been simply a principle. It was a promise. She understood now that it was also a foundation, and foundations were not destroyed by bad weather or corrupt judges or men in expensive coats. But she needed to get out of this carriage. She needed to get the journal back. She needed to figure out exactly what was inside that leather cover. Because whatever Sterling was willing to commit arson and assault and fraud to acquire was worth more than a silver claim on a piece of paper. She sat back from the window. The carriage moved. She made herself breathe slow and even. Her wrists were bound and her cheek was throbbing, and the smell of smoke was coming through the cracked window glass. She catalogued her resources. Not what she didn't have, what she did. She had her father's training. She had 7 weeks of mountain life that had taught her more about surviving difficult conditions than 30 years in Chicago had. She had the knowledge that Cassian was conscious and that Julian was already thinking, and that Gideon would not stay in those chains 1 moment longer than it was tactically necessary to stay in them. She had a scalpel she'd put in her boot that morning, out of a habit her father had instilled in her years ago. Always have your tools on your person. Evie. A doctor without her tools is just a person who knows what's wrong. She looked down at her boot. The carriage rolled down the mountain road. She let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. And then she set it aside. Not because it didn't matter. Because right now, what mattered was thinking clearly and moving when it was time to move, and not wasting a single ounce of herself on fear. She was Genevieve Thorne, her father's daughter, Iron Peak's partner, no one's property. She pressed her back against the carriage seat and looked out at the burning sky and began to plan. The hotel room in Bitter Creek was on the 2nd floor. Evie knew this because she'd counted the stairs when they brought her up 14 steps, a landing, then a right turn, and 6 more. She'd counted because her father had taught her that when you're moved somewhere against your will, the first thing you do is learn the geography. You don't panic, you map. The room was not uncomfortable. That was Sterling's particular style. She was beginning to understand. He didn't need to be cruel about the physical details. The cruelty was entirely in the legal architecture, the paperwork, the signatures, the careful construction of a world in which she had no standing. The room had a real bed and a washstand and curtains over the one window. These things were meant to communicate that she was being managed, not imprisoned. The distinction was important to a man like Sterling. The door was locked from the outside. There was a guard. She'd heard him settle into a chair in the corridor within 5 minutes of the door being bolted. Heard the creak of old wood under his weight. Heard him exchange 2 or 3 words with someone going down the stairs, and then nothing. By 9 o'clock, she could hear him breathing slowly. By 10, she could hear him snoring. She waited until midnight. She'd spent the hours between doing several things. She'd examined the room completely, which took about 8 minutes. She'd used the washstand. She'd sat on the bed with her hands in her lap and thought carefully through what she knew, what she needed, and in what order she needed to do it. She'd run the plan forward 3 times, looking for the problems, adjusting for the ones she found. She had the scalpel from her boot. The binding on her wrists had been cut by the hotel's housekeeper, a stout woman who'd looked at Evie once with unreadable eyes and said nothing. Evie had said, "Thank you." The woman had left. The scalpel was her father's smallest one. 3 inches of blade, the handle worn smooth from years. She held it in her palm and thought about what her father used to say. A tool is only as good as the intention behind it. Know exactly what you're doing before you begin. She knew exactly what she was doing. At midnight, she did not rush. She moved to the door and listened for two full minutes. The snoring was deep and irregular now, the specific rhythm of a man who had been drinking and was deeply under. She'd identified the smell on him when they'd passed in the corridor. Whiskey, a considerable amount. She knocked on the door. 3 light taps, a grunt. Shifting, the chair creaked. "I'm ill," she said, quiet, controlled. She put just enough into her voice. "I need water. I think I'm going to be sick." A pause, muttering. She put more urgency into it. "Please, I need a basin now." The bolt slid back. He opened the door, and she was already positioned to the right of the frame, rather than in front of it, which meant he had to turn his head to find her, which he did, which meant his eyes were moving in the wrong direction when she brought the heel of her palm up, hard under his jaw. She'd learned this, too, from her father. Not the violence of it. Her father was a gentleman, but the anatomy. The mandibular reflex, the way a sharp impact to the jaw produces a brief, involuntary shutdown of voluntary muscle function. Brief was enough. He went down. She caught him on the way and eased him to the floor because she was a doctor and she wasn't going to crack his skull on the floorboards if she could avoid it. She checked his pulse strong, regular, and left him on his side in the recovery position she'd have put any unconscious patient in. She took his key ring. She took his gun belt, not because she was planning to shoot anyone, but because a woman moving through a hotel corridor at midnight was considerably less likely to be challenged if she was wearing one. She put on her coat, which they'd hung on the door hook as if she were a guest, and she went down the hall. Sterling's room was 3 doors down. She knew because she'd heard his voice when they'd passed it, coming up. A short exchange with Judge Crowley about morning timing that she'd filed away without seeming to listen. The man talked freely in front of her, which told her exactly what he thought of her. She tried 3 keys before she found the right one. Sterling was asleep. The room smelled of cigar smoke and something more expensive, a good whiskey, the kind that came in real glass, not tin. His coat was over the chair back. His document case was open on the writing table. Her journal was right there, on top, as if he'd been reading it. She crossed the room without a sound and picked it up. She checked the leather cover. The thickness was still there, still intact. He hadn't found it yet, or hadn't known exactly where to press. She exhaled one short breath of pure relief and tucked it under her arm. Then she looked at the document case. Her father had taught her one more thing about situations like this, which was, always know more than your opponent knows you know. Information is the only resource that cannot be taken from you by force. She went through the case quickly and systematically. Not frantically, she didn't have time for frantic. She looked for what mattered. She found the fraudulent guardianship writ, which she recognized from when Crowley had produced it in the fort. Beneath it were 2 other documents. One was a transfer deed for her grandfather's silver claim, already signed by Sterling on the transferor's line, waiting for a second signature that would never come from her father, because her father was dead and Sterling had apparently decided to handle that complication through creative legal fiction. The other document was a ledger page. Folded once, she unfolded it. She understood what she was looking at within approximately 10 seconds. Sterling's private accounting, not the official one, the one that showed the payments to Judge Crowley. 3 separate payments, each one substantial, each one dated and initialed. Corrupt ledgers, the specific, concrete, irrefutable kind. She took everything. She folded the documents inside her journal, tucked it inside her coat against her body, and buttoned the coat over it. She was down the back stairs and out the hotel's delivery entrance 40 seconds later. The night was cold and clear, no moon to speak of. She kept close to the buildings on the back side of the main street, moving at a steady walk rather than a run, because running attracted attention, and walking fast looked purposeful, and purposeful was fine. She needed a horse. She found one at the livery, 3 buildings down, which was not locked, because Bitter Creek was not a town that locked its liveries, and the night hand was asleep in the hayloft. She saddled the quietest-looking animal in the row, a gray mare, who regarded her with complete indifference and stood still while she worked. She left the guard's gun belt on the post by the door, took a bridle from the wall, and led the mare out to the back alley before mounting. She rode north, toward Iron Peak, toward the men, who she trusted with an absolute confidence that came not from hope or longing, but from 7 weeks of direct accumulated evidence. She was about 2 miles out of Bitter Creek when the rain started. At approximately the same hour, Evie was lifting her father's journal from Sterling's desk. Julian Mercer was standing in front of Judge Crowley, in the front room of the Bitter Creek jailhouse, making the longest and most carefully constructed legal argument of his incomplete education. The jail was a single-room timber structure with 3 cells made of iron bars bolted to the back wall. 2 of those cells currently held the men of Iron Peak, Gideon and Julian in one, Zeke and Cassian in the other. Cassian's shoulder had been roughly bandaged by someone with minimal interest in the task, and the bleeding had slowed. He'd been upright and functional since approximately an hour after arrival, which told you something about Cassian. The chains had been replaced by cell bars, which was a technical improvement, but a practical equivalent. Julian had requested to address the judge on the first evening. Crowley had declined. Julian had requested again on the second morning, with the specific language of a man citing statutes he'd memorized verbatim. Crowley had declined again, but with less certainty. On the morning of the second day, Julian stood at the bars of the cell and delivered the opening argument that he'd been composing since the moment the chains went on in the fort courtyard. "Judge Crowley," he said, in the measured tone he used for things that required precision, "I intend to demonstrate 3 things. First, that the guardianship writ presented at Iron Peak Fortress was issued in violation of the Married Women's Property Act as extended in Colorado territory, which requires demonstrated incompetence or minority, neither of which applies to Miss Thorne. Second, that the charge of unlawful restraint was filed without witness testimony or physical evidence, and was therefore constitutionally insufficient for immediate arrest without warrant. Third, that you personally accepted payment from Bartholomew Sterling prior to the issuance of said writ, which constitutes criminal corruption of judicial process under federal statute." Crowley's face, which had started doughy and irritable, had gone through several other states during this and arrived at something considerably closer to alarmed. "You have no proof of any payment," Crowley said. Julian looked at him for a moment. "I have Sterling's own ledger," he said, "which I memorized in the 14 seconds I had to look at it before the document case was closed." This was not entirely true in its specifics, but was entirely true in spirit, and Julian had a very good memory. Crowley said nothing. "I would also note," Julian continued, "that U.S. Marshals have jurisdiction over cases involving federal land grant documents, And that Sheriff Hollister, whose office is 15 feet from where we are standing, has been a federal officer for 31 years and has, to my knowledge, never in that time been in Sterling's pocket. He paused. It might be worth considering, he said. What happens to your own legal standing once the marshals arrive? Crowley left the room. In the adjacent cell, Cassian had been watching this performance with his back against the wall and his good arm resting on his knee. How much of that was real, he said. Enough, Julian said. The payment ledger. Educated inference, Julian said. Sterling is meticulous. Men like Sterling always keep records of what they've paid out. It's how they maintain leverage. You bluffed a judge. Julian considered the word. I presented a logical certainty as an established fact, he said, which is a somewhat different thing. Gideon, who had been sitting with his back against the cell wall and his eyes on the door since they'd arrived, turned his head briefly. It bought us time, he said. It bought us time, Julian agreed. Time was what Zeke had been waiting for. He'd been quiet since they arrived, the particular stillness he went into when he was working through a problem rather than a piece of iron. He'd examined every inch of the cell. In the first hour, the bars, the bolts, the floor, the wall the cells were built against. The wall itself was old timber, old, and in the specific condition that comes from timber that has been in contact with mountain damp for too many years. He'd found the weak point on the second morning. The rear bolt mounting for the cell bars sat in a timber post that went into the floor. The floor was dirt. The post had been sinking slowly, barely perceptibly, but it had been sinking for years, and the movement had torqued the mounting slightly, enough to create a stress fracture in the wood at shoulder height. The fracture ran clean across the grain. Zeke had been pressing on it, carefully, for 2 hours. Just steady pressure, nothing dramatic, nothing that made noise. He didn't need to break the whole post. He needed to open the fracture enough that the bolt mounting would pull free. Cassian watched him work and said nothing, and kept his right arm still, and used his left hand to keep Zeke informed of what was happening in the front room, where Julian's voice was still going. The 2 war horses were tied outside. Sterling's men had ridden them, which meant they were big animals and well-trained, tied to the rail in front of the jailhouse. About 20 feet from the rear wall of the cell block, Cassian calculated the distance and the angle, and the chain length remaining on Zeke's wrists, and reached his conclusions. Tell me when, he said. Zeke pressed. One more time. Something shifted in the timber with a muffled crack deep in the grain, and he reached through the bars, found the chain loop Cassian held out, worked it through the gap in the mounting. They needed a 12-second window. Julian provided it by raising his voice the first and only time he'd done so since the argument began, and demanding Crowley state his professional credentials for the record. Crowley's voice rose in response. Cassian went out the cell door bars first, moving on his good shoulder, and crossed the back room in 4 strides to the window. He got it open. The chain was already running from Zeke's iron manacles through the wall gap and out the window. Cassian caught the loose end and went out the window head first. He landed in the mud outside, came up on one knee, looked at the 2 horses at the rail 10 feet to his right, and made a decision. He crossed to the horses at a dead run. He was not built for dead runs at this particular moment, with one bad shoulder and another healing leg. But he managed it. He looped the chain end over the saddle horn of the larger horse, took the reins of both animals, moved them back until the chain went taut. He looked at the wall. He spurred both horses forward. The sound the wall made when it came apart was not subtle. The entire rear section of the jailhouse, 3 feet of rotting timber on both sides of the cell block's back wall, came out in a single catastrophic piece. Taking the cell bars and their mounting posts with it, the horses staggered forward with the weight, and then regained their feet, and the wall was down. Gideon stepped through the gap without rushing. Zeke stepped through behind him. Julian's voice stopped in the front room. Crowley said something unintelligible. Julian walked out the front door at a normal pace, picked up the horse tied to the rail on the far end and brought it around to where his brothers were already mounted and moving. They went north, toward Iron Peak, toward Evie. The rain had been going for 2 hours. Before it occurred to Evie that it was not going to stop. She'd hoped initially for a passing squall mountain weather, moved fast, changed fast, and a half-hour downpour was common enough. But this was a different arrangement, the kind of cold March rain that has made a commitment. It came straight down in the dark, heavy and relentless, turning the mountain road into something that was less, a road and more a general suggestion of direction through expanding mud. The gray mare was a sensible animal. She picked her own footing, kept her head down, and moved at a steady pace that communicated she'd been through worse and had opinions about none of it. Evie kept her coat buttoned to the throat and kept the journal pressed against her chest and kept going. She was cold, soaked through to the second layer. Her hair was flat against her skull, and water was running down her neck, and her boots had given up being waterproof about 40 minutes ago. None of this was the point. She thought about Sterling's face when he'd struck her. She turned it over once, and then put it away. Dwelling on Sterling wasn't useful. Understanding him was. Sterling had spent his life treating other people's autonomy as a legal problem to be solved with the right documentation. He had built an entire architecture of fraud on the assumption that Evie Thorne was the kind of person who would absorb what he did and comply. That assumption, she thought, was going to be the most expensive mistake he'd ever made. The oak trees appeared on the left side of the road at the 2-mile mark north of Bitter Creek, a stand of old growth that had been there long enough to look like they owned the hillside, which they probably did. She was passing the first of them when she heard hooves. She pulled the mare up. Not Sterling's men. The sound was wrong, not organized, not the even spacing of riders moving in a deliberate search pattern. This was 4 horses moving fast with the particular urgency of people who have somewhere specific to be and intend to get there. She waited. They came out of the dark and the rain at a full gallop, and she recognized Gideon's horse first, a big black with a white star that she'd known from the stable for 2 months. Then the others, all 4, mud-covered and rain-soaked, chains still hanging from 2 of their wrists, moving like men who had been in a jailhouse an hour ago and were not going to be in one again. She stepped the mare forward into the road. They pulled up hard. For a moment, nobody moved. The rain came down between them. Then Gideon was off his horse. He came to her, and she came down from the mare, and they met in the mud between the horses without any of the distance they'd spent the early weeks maintaining. He put both arms around her, and she put her face against his shoulder and breathed him in wood smoke and iron and cold rain and something that was just specifically him and held on. The others arrived around them, not forming a circle, not surrounding anything, just arriving, the way people who belong to a place all arrive at it at once. Cassian reached her first after Gideon. His good arm came around her from the left, and he pressed his face briefly into her wet hair and said nothing, which was Cassian's most fluent language. Zeke took her free hand with his massive, gentle grip. That was all. Just held it. Julian stood just outside the 4 of them with rain running down his face, looking at her with the precise expression of a man who has been holding himself together on legal arguments and iron willpower for 48 hours and is now permitted to stop. "Julian," she said. He came forward and she pulled him in, and they were all 5 of them standing in the mud and rain at the oak tree line, and none of it was elegant or cinematic. It was just real. The kind of real that comes after several days of very bad events, when the people you feared losing are standing in front of you, present and breathing. Gideon pulled back first and looked at her face. He saw the bruise on her cheek immediately. She saw him see it. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way. It just went very still in a specific region around his eyes. "He hit you," he said. "He did," she said. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" "No." He nodded. His jaw was set in the particular way it set when he was deciding between two things, and she thought she knew what the two things were, and she appreciated that he chose the right one. Good, he said. He looked at her directly, steadily. Are you all right? Not a question exactly. A check. I am absolutely all right, she said, and meant it. She reached into her coat. The journal was damp at the edges, but the leather had done its job. She held it up. All four men looked at it the way you look at something you'd assumed was gone. She opened her coat further and produced the folded documents. The guardianship writ, she said. She held it up, then pulled the next papers free. Transfer deed for the silver claim, unsigned by anyone with legal authority to sign it, and a ledger page showing 3 separate payments from Sterling to Judge Crowley, each one dated and initialed. She held the ledger page out to Julian. He took it. Read it. His eyes moved quickly down the columns, and she watched him absorb the figures and the dates. This is enough, he said quietly. It's more than enough, she said. Gideon was looking at her face again, not at the documents. At her. How did you get out? He said. She told them. Plain and, in sequence, the snoring guard, the palm strike, the recovery position, the document case, the livery. She told it the same way she'd have told her father about a surgical procedure. What she did, in what order, and why, without apology or inflation when she finished. Nobody said anything for a moment. Cassian looked at her for a long beat. The recovery position, he said. He was unconscious, she said. I didn't want him aspirating anything. Something moved through Cassian's face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in that direction. Zeke exhaled once, long and slow, and she understood it for what it was: relief, finding its exit. Julian was still looking at the ledger page. We need Hollister, he said. We need him to see this tonight, before Sterling realizes what's gone. Hollister telegraphed the marshals. From town, Gideon said. He looked at the others. He came to the jail cell door while Julian was still arguing. 2 minutes, quiet. He told me he'd sent word the same night we were brought in. You didn't tell us, Cassian said. I didn't know how fast Crowley would move. I didn't want Julian adjusting his argument based on cavalry that might not arrive in time. He paused. Julian's argument was working. Julian looked up from the ledger page with an expression that was trying not to show. It was pleased. It was working, he confirmed, with full modesty. Evie gripped Gideon's hand. She hadn't planned the gesture, it just happened. Her hand finding his in the dark between them, she held it and turned to face all 4 of them. She wanted to be sure they heard this clearly. Not implied, not subtext, said. I need to say something, she said. They listened. The rain came down. I need to say it to all of you, but I need to say it where anyone who's listening can hear it, because I intend to keep saying it for the rest of my life. She looked from face to face. Gideon, Cassian, Zeke, Julian, I am no property to be fought over. I am your partner. Together we will use truth and justice to defend our home. Nobody spoke. The rain filled the silence, and it was a good silence, the kind that means something has been said that doesn't need adding to. Gideon squeezed her hand once. Yes, he said. Just that. She let it breathe for one more moment, and then she was ready to move. Sterling woke up at some point in the last hour, she said, when he found the journal gone and the guard on the floor and the document case empty. He did not sit down quietly. He is going to be moving. And he's going to be moving with 6 armed men and the temper of someone who has just discovered that the plan failed. What do we need? Gideon said. We need Hollister with the incriminating documents in his hands before Sterling gets to him, she said. And we need to get back to the fort. The children are there. That last part landed on all 4 men simultaneously. She saw it. Zeke was already turning back to his horse. The children are not alone, Gideon said, but he was also moving. I left Thomas with the rifle and instructions. He knows what to do. Thomas is 11, Evie said. Thomas, Gideon said, with apparent specific gravity, is a particular kind of 11. This was true, and she knew it, but she was still on her horse before he finished the sentence. They rode hard for Bitter Creek first. 20 minutes back the way she'd come, the rain still going. The road a challenge, but manageable. Evie rode with the documents inside her coat and the journal flat against her ribs and her heels, down in the stirrups like Cassian had shown her 3 weeks ago. Sheriff Caleb Hollister answered his door at 3 in the morning in a flannel nightshirt and boots, which meant he'd been sleeping in the boots, which meant he hadn't been sleeping much at all. He was 64 years old and built like a man who had spent those years doing things that required being built solidly. White-haired and sharp-eyed, he looked at the 5 of them on his doorstep, soaked muddy, Cassian with one arm in a crude sling, Zeke and Gideon still wearing pieces of iron chain at their wrists, and said nothing for a long moment. "Come in," he said. They came in. Hollister had a good fire and a large kitchen table, and hanged law books on his shelves that you acquire over 30 years of treating the job as a calling rather than a position. He sat across the table from them and read the ledger page and the guardianship writ and the unsigned transfer deed, and he did this without hurry. In the way, a man reads things when he intends to act on what he reads. When he finished, he put the papers on the table. He looked at Julian. "You extracted these from Sterling's room." "Miss Thorne extracted them," Julian said. Hollister looked at Evie. "I found them in plain sight on the writing table," she said, "in a room I had been brought to by that same man without my consent and against my legal rights as an adult citizen." Hollister's expression moved minimally in the direction of satisfaction. He pulled the papers to him. "I've been carrying a federal warrant for Sterling for 6 months," he said. "Fraud in the acquisition of mineral claims. 3 prior instances in Nevada and Wyoming. I needed documentation of this particular crime, which I did not have until right now." He set his hand flat on the papers. "I will have the marshals in Bitter Creek within 48 hours. They were already moving when I sent the telegram." "Sterling will move on the fort," Gideon said. Hollister nodded. "He knows he's losing the legal ground," Julian said. "When men like Sterling lose the legal ground, they try to destroy the evidence, the fort itself, the journal. He knows I have the journal now, or he will. When he's fully awake, then we need to be at the fort before he is," Gideon said. Hollister stood. He went to his desk and produced a sealed envelope, already addressed. He handed it to Evie. "My sworn statement," he said, "given to a U.S. Marshal's deputy 3 days ago when he passed through on circuit. His signature is there, too. It covers everything I witnessed in the weeks prior to Sterling's arrival." He looked at her directly. "If anything happens to those papers, my sworn testimony stands on its own. Sterling knows my reputation." She took the envelope, added it to the oilskin inside her coat. "Sheriff," she said. He looked at her. "When this is over," she said, "I'd like you to come up to the fort under regular circumstances. For dinner." He looked at her for a moment. Something crossed his face that was old and genuine and had nothing to do with legal documents. "I'd be glad to," he said. They left Bitter Creek before 4 in the morning, riding hard up the mountain road in the rain. The horses knew the way. The oak trees fell behind them. The pines closed in. The trail narrowed and rose. The rain eased somewhere around the halfway mark, dropping to a thin mist. Evie rode between Cassian and Julian, Gideon ahead, Zeke behind. Not because anyone had arranged it that way, just because it was where they all fit. She thought about the documents pressed against her chest. The ledger, the guardianship writ that was going to be unwrapped and shown to be exactly what it was. Fraud dressed in the costume of law. The original silver deed hidden in her father's journal cover, which she hadn't gotten to open yet, but which she understood now was the real thing. Sterling had been after all along. Not her. Not her compliance or her person. The deed, the claim, the silver. He'd used her as a vehicle to get to her father's land. Had been using her father likely for years, working toward this moment. She thought about that, and she wasn't frightened. She was clear. There was a specific kind of clarity that comes when you stop being confused about what someone wants from you and start understanding it exactly. And this was it. Sterling had made one fundamental miscalculation. He had built his entire plan on the assumption that Genevieve Thorne was alone in the world and without resources. She was a woman. Her father was dead. She was in an unfamiliar territory. She had no husband, no male guardian, no legal standing that he hadn't provided himself through his fraudulent writ. He had assumed, essentially, that she was something that could be managed. He had not accounted for the fort on the mountain. He had not accounted for 4 men who had built their lives on the principle that a person's self-determination was not a legal technicality, but an absolute condition of any arrangement they'd be party to. He had not accounted for a sheriff with a 31-year reputation and a federal connection. He had not accounted for what happened to a woman who spent 7 weeks on an iron mountain in winter, what it builds in you, what it confirms about what you already had. The fort appeared through the tree line as the mist thinned, the palisade walls still standing. The gate closed and latched from inside, which meant Thomas had done exactly as Gideon said he would. Gideon called out at the gate. A pause, a young voice asking who. "It's us," Gideon said. "Open up." The bolt drew back. Thomas opened the gate with the rifle in the crook of his arm, stock down, the way Gideon had apparently shown him. He looked at the 5 of them on their horses, wet, muddy, returning in a condition that told a clear story, and his face went through relief and then into the composed look of someone deciding which questions were most urgent. He looked at Evie specifically. "You got out," he said. "I got out," she said. He nodded, clearly filing this away as information about what Evie Thorne was capable of. Hannah appeared behind him in the doorway of the main house, both braids coming undone, one boot on, regarding the scene with the same grave judicial attention she brought to most situations. "You're wet," she said to Evie. "I am very wet," Evie agreed. Hannah appeared to make a decision. "Come inside," she said. "I made the fire bigger." She turned and went back in, and Evie exchanged one look with Gideon, brief, full, containing a complete conversation, and then they were through the gate and home. Whatever was coming next would come. Sterling would wake. He would act. The fort would face it. But right now there was a fire that Hannah had made bigger, and 5 people and 5 children inside walls that had been built by men who understood what it meant to build something worth defending. She went inside. Sterling didn't wait until morning. Evie had expected him to. She'd expected him to wake up, discover what was missing, spend an hour in cold fury drinking the rest of his expensive whiskey, and then organize himself. Men like Sterling were planners. They thought in steps. She'd underestimated his rage. He came at dawn. The first shot hit the palisade wall 3 inches above the firewatch platform where Cassian was standing. He dropped below the timberline without thinking, already calling it out, his voice carrying through the still morning air before the echo of the shot finished, rolling back off the cliff face. Riders, 10 at minimum, armed, moving fast from the south trail. Evie was in the main house. She heard him, put down the coffee she'd been holding, and went immediately to the children's room. 5 faces turned to her. Thomas was already on his feet, with the look of someone who understood exactly what the sound meant. Hannah was dressed. The younger ones were at various stages of waking. "Get dressed," Evie said, quickly, quietly. "Thomas, you're in charge in here. You do not open this door for anyone except me or Gideon. Do you understand?" Thomas understood. He was 12 years old, and he understood perfectly. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She pulled the door closed behind her and drew the iron bar across the outside bracket, not locking them in, locking everything else out. The fort was already in motion. Gideon had the high terrain organized in the first 5 minutes. That was the word for it, organized. He moved each person to a position with a specific purpose and said what he needed said and nothing extra. Cassian on the front palisade, highest point, Winchester and a good angle on the south trail. Julian at the eastern corner, with a rifle he knew how to use, and a sightline covering the blind approach along the cliff base. Zeke at the gate with his physical presence, which was its own kind of fortification. and a heavy iron bar across the entrance that would require a battering ram to shift. Gideon himself took the center ground. Evie was not put somewhere. She put herself at the forge, building the one structure with its own door, its own fire, and a solid supply of materials she knew how to work with medically. She converted the workbench into a field station. Carbolic, clean linen. Her father's instruments, which she'd repacked after the last emergency and had ready in their leather roll, she'd need them. She didn't know for whom or how badly, but she'd need them. Sterling came through the tree line at the head of 12 men, not 6. 12. He'd gone back to somewhere another town, another resource, and arrived with more. He was on a gray stallion, and he was dressed even now, in his good coat, and the fury on his face was controlled, which was worse than uncontrolled. Controlled fury in a man like Sterling was planning. It was purpose. He stopped at the gate. "Thorn," he called. Gideon's voice came back from the palisade wall. "Level. Carrying." "She doesn't speak for you when you call at her door uninvited," he said. "You want to talk, you address this fort." A pause. "You're out of options," Sterling said. "I have a legal order." "Presented to whom?" Julian said from the eastern wall. "Also level. Considerably dry. The documents you're referring to are currently in Sheriff Hollister's hands, along with a federal warrant and a sworn statement from a U.S. Marshal's deputy. What you have is a ledger showing payments to a compromised judge and a transfer deed with no valid signature. You're welcome to present those to the court." Sterling looked toward the eastern wall. Then he nodded to the man on his left. The shooting started. It was not organized gunfighting. It was suppression fire, aimed at the palisade walls and the firewatch platforms to keep heads down, while a second group worked the south approach, looking for a weak point. Evie heard it from inside the forge, the crack and snap of rifles, the impact of rounds on timber. Cassian returning fire in the measured, economical way of a man who counted every shot. She heard Zeke's voice from the gate, not shouting, just loud, and then the heavy crash of something hitting the gate from outside. Once, twice, they had a ram. She'd expected that. The gate held. Zeke had rebuilt the crossbar from iron stock over the past 2 weeks. Because Zeke looked at things and saw their structural weaknesses and addressed them without being asked. Cassian caught one of Sterling's flanking riders crossing an open stretch of ground and put a round through the man's shoulder at 200 yards. She heard the man go down. She heard the group on that side pull back. She was moving before she consciously decided to. Out the forge door, staying low along the covered walkway, to the corner of the main house where Gideon had a line of sight to the south approach and the gate simultaneously. "One man down on the south side," she said. "Shoulder. He's going to need me." Gideon glanced at her. "Not yet," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm telling you so you know the situation." He held her gaze for exactly half a second. Then he turned back to the approach. Sterling was regrouping. She could see it through the gap between palisade, logs the men pulling back to the tree line. Sterling on the gray stallion, someone beside him talking fast. Sterling was listening. He was changing approach. She saw the torch before she understood what it meant. He was going for the main house, the evidence, the journal. The man with the torch broke from the tree line at a run, heading for the far side of the main house where the walls backed against the cliff, and there was no firewatch position covering the angle. Smart, ruthlessly smart. Gideon saw it at the same moment. He left his position. Evie went after him without thinking, and they came around the far corner of the main house at a dead run, just as the torchman reached the wall. He wasn't expecting to meet Gideon Stone at close quarters. Nobody was ever quite prepared for that. The torch hit the ground, and Gideon had the man's arm, and the situation was resolved in a matter of seconds that Evie didn't try to describe afterward. She stepped forward and extinguished the torch with her boot heel. A sound then, from outside the walls, different from the gunfire. Hooves, many of them, moving fast, not from Sterling's direction, from the north road, coming down through the trees the long way around the cliff base. The approach that didn't show itself until you were already nearly at the gate. She heard a voice she recognized. Hollister. His voice had a particular quality that came from 31 years of shouting over situations exactly like this one. It wasn't loud for its own sake. It was loud because it needed to reach very specific ears. U.S. Marshals. All armed parties lay down. Sterling, you are under federal warrant for fraud and criminal conspiracy. This is your one instruction. Silence fell in stages, like something heavy lowering itself slowly to the ground. Sterling's men went first, then Sterling. The torch dropped in the mud. The gray stallion stood still. The marshals came through in a column of 8, Hollister riding at the front on his old bay. And they moved with the precision of people who had done exactly this before and had the federal authority and the personal confidence to make the next 60 seconds of Sterling's life entirely predictable. Sterling made one more decision. He turned the gray stallion toward the main house, toward the wall where the torch had been, toward whatever evidence he still thought he could reach, and Evie stepped out of the shadow of the covered walkway and stood in his path. He pulled the horse up short. She was looking up at him. She had the journal in one hand. The sealed documents from Hollister's envelope were visible at its edge. She looked at his face, and she understood something clearly. He'd spent his whole career believing that the woman in front of him was always going to step aside. She stood very still. A marshal's horse appeared at Sterling's right, another at his left. He looked at Evie for one long moment. Then it was done. The injured man on the south side of the fort needed her within the next 3 minutes. So that was where she went. The great hall looked different without the benches. Gideon had built the trestle tables years ago from old-growth timber, and they were heavy and permanent feeling, in a way that most things at Iron Peak were heavy and permanent feeling. For the circuit court session, they'd been moved to the walls and replaced with a central arrangement of chairs, a proper judge's table at the north end, and standing room along the sides, where the light came through the windows in long horizontal bars. It was the first week of April. The snow on the lower slopes had started pulling back from the south-facing rock faces. The light that came through the windows was a different quality than winter light, warmer, more specific, landing on surfaces and staying there. Judge Elias Carver had ridden up from Denver with 2 clerks and a deputy of his own. He was a small man, compact and precise, with a written record of federal decisions that Julian had described to Evie as clean, which from Julian meant something considerable. He'd examined the evidence the previous afternoon for 3 hours with Hollister and the marshals, and had said almost nothing to anyone except procedural questions. He sat now at the judge's table, with his papers arranged to his left, and looked at the room. Sterling was there, in a chair between 2 marshals. He was still wearing a good coat, which seemed like the last holdout of something. He didn't look at anyone in particular. He looked at the table in front of him with the specific expression of a man who has been calculating and keeps arriving at the same number. Judge Crowley was in the second row, his public function already effectively over. The marshals had his signed confession from the previous evening, obtained through a conversation whose specifics hadn't been shared with Evie, but whose outcome was evident. Evie sat in the front row with her father's journal in her lap. Gideon sat on her left, Cassian on her right, Zeke and Julian behind. This wasn't arrangement. It was just where they sat. The children were in the back room with Thomas in charge, which Evie trusted completely. Judge Carver opened the proceedings with the formality of a man who respected the law enough to give it its proper architecture. He stated the charges. They were comprehensive: federal fraud in the filing of false guardianship documents, criminal conspiracy to fraudulently acquire mineral land rights, corrupt inducement of a judicial officer, assault with a deadly weapon, arson of a private dwelling, unlawful imprisonment. Sterling's attorney, who had arrived from somewhere and looked as though he wished he hadn't sat with a legal pad and a carefully neutral expression. The evidence went in first. the guardianship writ and its specific legal deficiencies. As outlined by Julian, in a brief, precise statement that Judge Carver read with his full attention, the payment ledger, authenticated by Hollister's testimony about the handwriting and the accounts, the unsigned transfer deed, Hollister's own sworn statement, the marshal deputy's countersignature. Then Carver looked up. "Miss Thorne," he said, "I understand you have additional evidence relevant to the land claim at issue." She stood. She crossed the floor from the front row to the center of the room. She was wearing the best dress she owned, which wasn't particularly fine by Chicago standards, but it was clean and it fit. And it was hers. Her hair was up. Her hands were steady. She placed her father's journal on the judge's table. She took the small knife she'd borrowed from Cassian, short-bladed, precise, and she pressed it carefully into the seam along the inner edge of the back leather cover. The stitching her father had made was tight and old, but it gave cleanly when she worked it. The cover lifted, a folded document. Thin as onion skin, pressed flat for years inside. The leather came free. She unfolded it carefully. She knew what it was before she looked at it. She'd felt the shape of it through the leather, often enough in the past weeks. The original boundary deed for the Thorne Silver claim. Bitter Creek County, Colorado Territory. Filed in 1851 by her grandfather, witnessed by two men whose names she didn't recognize. Signed and sealed by a land office official in a hand faded with age but entirely legible. Legal. Real. Predating Sterling's interests in the matter by more than 30 years. She placed it beside the journal. Then she turned to face the room. She'd thought about what she wanted to say. She'd thought about it in the way she thought about difficult procedures, clearly, in advance. Knowing what she wanted to accomplish and in what order. She didn't want to perform. She wanted to be understood. "Your Honor," she said, "the document before you establishes that the mineral claim Bartholomew Sterling has spent 2 years attempting to acquire through fraud and force has belonged to my family, since before most of this territory was formalized into law. It was my grandfather's. It was my father's. It is mine." She paused. "I would also like to say something to this court that I believe is relevant to how this case came to exist at all." Carver looked at her. He waited. "A woman has the right to own her inheritance," she said. "The right to reject coercion and to choose whom she loves without needing permission from any powerful man." She held the room without raising her voice, because she didn't need to raise her voice. Mr. Sterling's scheme depended on the assumption that a woman alone is legally and practically vulnerable. That assumption is wrong, not because the law has always prevented such schemes. It has not, but because it is wrong in the way that all fundamental violations of human dignity are wrong. This court can help establish that such schemes carry real consequences. I ask it to do so. The room was quiet, not uncomfortable, quiet. The quiet of a room in which something true has been said, and everyone present understands that it was true. Judge Carver looked at her for a moment. "The court has received your statement, Miss Thorne," he said. "You may be seated." She picked up the deed and the journal and walked back to her chair. Gideon's hand found hers when she sat down. She held it. The deliberation took 4 hours. Sterling's attorney made arguments that were technically constructed and practically insufficient, given the weight of evidence and the nature of the charges. Judge Carver listened to everything and wrote a great deal, and interrupted twice to ask Julian clarifying questions about the specific statutes applicable to the guardianship fraud, which Julian answered with the precision of a man who had been waiting for exactly these questions. The verdict came in the late afternoon when the light through the windows had gone gold. Bartholomew Sterling guilty, on all counts. Sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in the federal penitentiary. The fraudulent documents voided. All claims filed under those documents nullified. Evie listened to the sentence read aloud and felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled since the morning her father died. After the proceedings, She asked Judge Carver and Hollister to remain for the legal business. She laid out what she intended to do with the silver claim. She'd thought about it carefully, and she hadn't asked the men in advance, which was deliberate. She wanted it to be her decision made freely, not a negotiated outcome. Equal shares. 1/4 to Gideon, Cassian, Zeke, and Julian. Collectively, to be held in trust for the operation and maintenance of Iron Peak. The remaining portion divided between a direct claim in Evie's name and a separate trust administered by Hollister for the benefit of orphaned children in Bitter Creek County. She slid the papers across the table. Carver read them. He signed where his signature was required. Hollister signed as witness. She looked up at the 4 men sitting along the wall. They'd heard all of it. None of them said the obvious thing, which was that she hadn't had to do it this way. She could have kept it all. She could have built a different kind of life. Gideon looked at her with the full honest attention she'd come to understand, was his way of communicating what he didn't put into words. Julian looked at the window for a moment, then back at her, and nodded once. Zeke's jaw worked briefly. Cassian looked at the paper in Carver's hands for a moment. Then he looked at her. The orphan trust, he said. Yes, she said. He was quiet. His amber eyes said what his mouth didn't bother with. Good, he said. April came in earnest. The snow didn't disappear. It wouldn't fully disappear until May on the upper slopes. But it pulled back in the lower valley with the conviction of something that's been beaten fairly. The ground underneath was soft and dark and generating things. The first wildflowers came up through the mud along the south-facing base of the palisade wall, something small and yellow that Hannah found and reported on with great gravity. There are flowers, she told Gideon at breakfast. Spring flowers, he said. They were there yesterday, she said. They weren't. Sometimes things arrive like that, he said. Hannah appeared to find this philosophically adequate. She went back to her bowl. Julian started teaching the children outside on good mornings, botany first, which had become Thomas's particular obsession. The rocks temporarily displaced by his growing catalog of plant species and their properties. Samuel was learning to read music, which surprised everyone, including Samuel, who had shown no previous interest in instruments until Julian let him hold the violin one afternoon. And the expression on his face had told the story plainly enough. Clinic project had been Evie's and Julian's together, and they'd been planning it since January, in the quiet hours after supper. A proper room, properly equipped, real shelves, dedicated space for the instruments, the medicines, the botanical preparations. Julian knew how to compound, and Evie knew how to apply. A door with her name on it, which Julian had proposed and which she'd declined twice before accepting on the third offer. Zeke built it in 3 weeks. He built it onto the east end of the main house, timber and dovetail, joinery, and a window positioned exactly where she asked for it, facing north so the light was even through the day. He installed the shelves at the heights she specified without asking her why she wanted them there, which she appreciated. He built the examining table from solid oak. He carved her name into the lintel over the door, in letters that were more precise than you'd expect. From hands that large, Dr. E. Thorne, Free Clinic. She stood under it on the morning it was finished and looked at the carved letters for a long time. Your father would have approved, Julian said from behind her. She didn't answer for a moment. He would have made suggestions about the shelf spacing, she said. Julian smiled. The schoolroom went in beside it. Julian's domain, with Evie's contributions in anatomy and basic science. Real slates, real chalk. Maps Julian sourced from a contact in Denver who owed him a favor whose nature Evie had never been told. A globe that Thomas immediately spun too fast and that Clara caught before it hit the floor, establishing Clara's reputation as the fort's most reliable rapid responder to minor disasters. The ceremony was Evie's idea, not in those terms. She hadn't used the word ceremony at first, she'd said. One evening in early May, with the windows open, and the spring evening coming through with the pine smell and the particular sound of a mountain that has decided to be warm again, that she wanted to mark things. Gideon had been looking at the fire. He turned his head. "Mark what?" he said. "Everything," she said. "The fact that we're here, that we chose this, that we're going to keep choosing it." She looked at him and then at the others around the room. "I don't need a piece of paper from a courthouse. I need to say it out loud, under the sky, in front of people we trust." Nobody argued. The day they chose was the 15th of May. The valley below Iron Peak had done something over the previous weeks that felt almost like an announcement. Wildflowers in every gap between rocks, in every soft patch of mountain earth, in the long grass along the creek bed, purple and yellow and white. The children had been collecting them for 3 days, serious, as a committee, and had produced by the morning of the ceremony a collection of arrangements that filled every available surface of the great hall and the courtyard. Thomas had also found an excellent rock, which he presented to Gideon as a gift. Gideon thanked him with the gravity the gift deserved. Hollister came up from Bitter Creek. He'd been up twice, since the trial once, for the dinner Evie had promised him. Once, because Thomas had sent him a letter inviting him to see the new classroom, which had touched the old sheriff in ways he didn't discuss. 3 families from town came. The blacksmith from Bitter Creek, who'd sold Zeke iron stock for 3 years and had never said anything much but showed up, the schoolteacher. A quiet woman named Mrs. Alcott, who had been corresponding with Evie and Julian about the clinic project. A farmer and his wife from the lower valley, whose son Evie had treated for a bad chest last winter and who'd brought a pie as large as a wagon wheel. Judge Carver came. That surprised her. He'd ridden all the way from Denver for a Saturday, which said something about him that the record of his decisions had already suggested. They gathered in the open courtyard under a sky that had committed itself completely to blue. The ceremony didn't have an officiant in the traditional sense. It didn't need one. Hollister stood at the front as the senior figure present and had the particular bearing of a man doing something he believed in, which was the only kind of ceremony that ever meant anything. Evie and the 4 men stood together, facing the gathered people of their life. She said what she'd said in the rain at the oak tree line, because it was still true, and she wanted more witnesses, that she was no one's property, that she was a partner, that what stood between them was choice made freely and intended to last. Each man said his version of the same thing in his own language. Gideon said it in 6 words. "She is mine as I am hers." He said it to the 4 corners of it, to Evie, to his brothers, to Hollister, to the courtyard. The 4 corners equally. Cassian said it by taking her hand and not letting go. Zeke said he hadn't had much of a family before and intended to make a very good one from here on out. And Clara started crying, which she denied immediately when anyone looked at her. Julian said something that went longer and was more precise and contained a legal citation about the definition of a family under natural law that made Judge Carver raise his eyebrows and nod once in appreciation. Then Gideon turned to the people gathered there. He'd thought about this part. Evie knew, because she'd seen him thinking about it for 2 weeks, the particular focused quiet that meant he was working towards something he wanted to get exactly right. "Family is defined by safety and human dignity," he said, "not by paper or bloodlines." He looked across the people in the courtyard. Hollister, the farmer and his wife, the schoolteacher, the blacksmith, the children distributed through the gathering like punctuation. What we've built here is one version of that definition. The clinic will be another. The school will be another. We intend to keep building. A pause. "Anyone in this valley who needs what we have here is welcome to it," he said. "That's what we're marking today." He wasn't a man who spoke much, so when he spoke, it reached. Hollister shook Gideon's hand afterward, a long, formal grip. "Your father would have been glad to know you," Hollister said. Gideon looked at him. "Did you know him?" he said. "I knew of him," Hollister said. "Good men leave records. Not in courthouses," he gestured, loosely, at the fort around them, "in the things they build." Julian's violin started somewhere toward the end of the afternoon. He was on the covered walkway, the case open on the bench beside him, playing with the particular ease of someone who isn't performing, but who simply needs the instrument to be part of what's happening. The melody moved through the courtyard and mixed with the children's voices and with the steady ring of Zeke's anvil from the forge, where he'd gone after the ceremony to finish a piece of work he'd been in the middle of. Because Zeke's relationship with the forge was like Julian's relationship with the violin. It was how he inhabited his own life. The sound of the two together, violin and anvil, was not something Evie had expected to love as much as she did. She sat on the palisade steps in the late afternoon with Hannah beside her and the valley spread out below. The wildflowers, the creek, the long gold light going horizontal across the peaks. Hannah had her important things box in her lap. She opened it and took out a small yellow wildflower she'd pressed between two flat rocks, the kind of preservation a 9-year-old arrives at independently. She held it out to Evie. "For you," Hannah said. Evie took it. "What was it for originally?" she asked. Hannah considered. "Important things," she said. "That's you." Evie held the small pressed flower and looked out at the valley her grandfather had walked into in 1851 with a claim and a hope, and apparently enough sense to write it all down in the right documents and give them to a man he trusted, to hide them in the right leather cover, and get them to the right person at the right time. It had taken 74 years from claim to clinic, a complicated route, but here it was. Thomas's voice came from the direction of the schoolroom. He was telling Samuel something about a rock formation he'd seen on the south slope. Samuel was listening the way Samuel listened to everything with his whole attention, like he was going to need to remember it. Clara and Miriam came through the courtyard running, which they did approximately half of every waking hour. Gideon appeared in the doorway of the main house. He looked at Evie on the steps, at Hannah beside her, at the valley below. He didn't say anything. He came and sat on the step below her, leaned his back against the boards, and turned his face up toward the last of the sun. Cassian came out a few minutes later, sat on the top step. Then Julian, violin case in hand, settled on the lower step and opened the case again and played something slow and irresolute that wandered the courtyard like a friendly animal looking for a comfortable place to stop. Zeke came last. He filled the remaining space on the steps without ceremony and put his enormous forearms on his knees and looked at the valley with the expression of a man who has worked hard all his life and intends to keep doing exactly that and has arrived in the process, somewhere he did not expect. The spring evening came in. The light went amber, then copper, then soft. The American West had a reputation built largely on violence, on the fiction of the lone man against the wilderness, against the villain, against the law, against nature, on the idea that what the frontier produced and rewarded was a particular kind of hardness. What Iron Peak had found was something else, not softer, actually harder, in the ways that lasted, the kind of hard that comes from building something instead of just surviving it, from choosing people and meaning it, from treating the person beside you as fully human, even when the paperwork didn't require it, especially when the paperwork didn't require it. The children's laughter moved through the courtyard like weather. Julian's violin found its resolution finally, a quiet major chord settling into the evening air, then letting go. Hannah opened her important things box and put a second flower in it, one she found in the grass beside the step. She looked at it critically, decided it was acceptable, closed the lid. "What are you going to put in there next?" Evie asked. Hannah thought about this seriously. "I'll know it when I find it," she said. Evie looked out at the valley. Yes, she thought. That was exactly right. There's a moment near the end of this story that stays with you long after the final page. Hannah, a 9-year-old orphan with a box of important things, presses a small wildflower into Evie's hand and says simply, "That's you. You're an important thing." No grand speech. No declaration. Just a child who had lost everything, quietly telling a woman who had risked everything, "You matter here." That's what this story is really about. We live in a world that still tries to define people by what they're worth on paper, by contracts, by titles, by what they can produce, provide, or prove. Evie Thorne arrived in Bitter Creek Valley with $1, city shoes sinking into the snow, and a marriage proposal she didn't fully understand. By every conventional measure, she had nothing. By every measure that actually counts, she was exactly what Iron Peak needed, and Iron Peak was exactly what she needed. But here's what the story asks you to sit with. Belonging isn't something you're handed. It's something you build. Evie didn't find a home waiting for her at the end of that train platform. She stepped into a blizzard and built one slowly, imperfectly, one honest conversation at a time. With 4 men who didn't know how to raise children. With 5 orphans who didn't know how to trust. With a valley that didn't know what to make of any of them. And the Stone brothers. Let's talk about them for a moment, because they are not what Western fiction usually gives us. They're not lone wolves. They're not conquerors. They are 4 soldiers who came home from war, looked at 5 parentless children in a mining camp and said, "Not on our watch." Walls and a forge and a schoolroom. They sent a letter asking for help because they were brave enough to admit they didn't have all the answers. That kind of strength, the kind that says, "I cannot do this alone," is the hardest kind and the rarest. What Evie and the Stone brothers created at Iron Peak wasn't a conventional family. It was something more deliberate than that. Every person there chose to be there. Every morning was a renewed decision to stay, to contribute, to treat the person beside them as fully human. That choice, made quietly and consistently over months and seasons, became something no document could have created and no storm could take down. This story also carries a quieter message, one that speaks directly to anyone who has ever felt like they arrived somewhere too late, too underprepared, with too little. Evie's grandfather walked into that valley in 1851 with a claim and a hope. 74 years later, that hope became a clinic, a school, a family, a ceremony under an open blue sky with wildflowers and a blacksmith's anvil ringing in the background. The things we build in good faith, even when we don't live to see them finished, have a way of finding the right hands. And perhaps most importantly, this is a story about what community actually looks like when it's built on dignity instead of obligation. The sheriff, who showed up not because he had to, but because it meant something. The blacksmith who sold iron stock for 3 years and drove out on a Saturday because some things deserve witnesses. The judge who rode from Denver, because good people leave records not in courthouses, but in the things they build. Iron Peak wasn't perfect. It was cold and hard, and it asked everything of the people who chose it. But it was honest, and it was safe. And in the end, that combination, honesty and safety, is the only foundation that holds. So if this story leaves you with anything, let it be this. You don't have to be everything to be enough. You just have to show up, tell the truth, and choose the people beside you like you mean it. That's what Evie did. That's what the Stone brothers did. That's what Hannah did with her important things box. She kept making room for what mattered. We could all stand to do the same. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, locations, and dialogue are entirely products of the author's imagination and are not intended to represent any real persons, living or dead, or actual historical events. The depiction of the American West and frontier life is dramatized for narrative purposes and does not claim historical accuracy. This content is created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental.